You know, smart walleye anglers know that walleyes love to fish in the weeds, but we also know that they're tough to get out of the weeds sometimes. But what we're going to do today is show you a rig that is very simple to tie, very simple to use, and very effective. We call it the weed drift rig. Now, built out of necessity, it is kind of an adaptation of a Lindy rig or a slip sinker rig, if you will. My brother Kirk, actually, I'm going to give him the credit for all this rig. We were pre-fishing for a tournament one day, and Kirk was wanting to smoke a cigarette and wanting to have a sandwich, and we were fishing in the weeds. So we were casting crankbaits, casting jigs. We were really working, if you will, doing a lot of casting. I said, hey, go ahead, have a cigarette, have a sandwich if you want, but get something in the water. So he shuffled around in the tackle box, put something in the water, and before he could get his first cigarette smoked, he said, I got a fish. He reeled in a fish, about a 19, 20-incher fish, which at the lake we were fishing was a good-sized fish. I said, do it again. He put it back in the water. A couple minutes later, he had another one, and pretty soon he had a third. So I was hooked that we had something here that was probably going to work. Now, how effective has the weed drift rig been for me? It has won me more money tournament fishing than any other presentation that I've used, and I have yet to fish a tournament where I've used the weed drift rig in the weeds that I haven't cashed a big fish check. Yes, big fish live in the weeds and they can be extracted. So stay tuned, sit back. I'm going to show you an easy, simple way that with just a little bit of work with your boat control, you can extract good walleyes out of weeds, no matter how heavy they are, with an easy presentation that's fun to fish. Stay tuned. We're talking about the weed drift rig. Okay, so before we can really talk about why the weed drift rig works and the details of it, let's talk a little bit about how walleyes live in the weeds, specifically cabbage. Cabbage is the best weed bed that we want to fish this weed drift rig in because cabbage grows in a stalk. So it has a main stalk and then it has leaves off of it. So we look at a cabbage bed and go, holy moly, that's really, really thick. But from the bottom of the lake up to about 12 inches, it's just the stalk before the leaves start to grow. So these walleyes and every other fish have 12 to 18 inches on the bottom to just kind of go through the stalks, which are easy to get through. They don't have to get through that canopy of leaves. Now that canopy of leaves holds bugs, holds snails, hides bait fish, creates cover, creates shade, creates security for walleyes and bait fish. All of that cover, all those leaves created by cabbage weeds create things that walleyes love to have. But below that is that 12, 18, 24 inches of open water that walleyes can move through, and that's where we're going to put the weed drift rig down there in that open area so walleyes can find it, see it, eat it, and you can catch some. So understand how cabbage weeds work and how fish live in them. It's going to make it a lot easier to understand why this weed drift rig is so effective. So now that we know how walleyes live in the weeds, especially cabbage, and when they have that open area, let's talk about how the weed drift rig works. I want to get into details a little bit later about rigging it, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a lure or a bait, and we're going to get it down underneath that heavy cabbage. So we're going to have a sinker. We'll talk about all this in just a second. A sinker, a hook, a piece of bait, and some kind of attractor on this hook, and it is going to be fished in a way that keeps it below the heavy cabbage leaves and keeps it just down in the stalks. That's the important part. We're down underneath the canopy where all the fish live. Now, the way we're going to fish it is going to keep it down there. It's going to keep it moving slowly through the weeds. The bait is going to be in the fish's face where it can attract, trigger, and get fish to bite. And it's going to fish, believe it or not, fairly weedless most of the time. But getting caught up on the weeds is actually a good part of the weed drift rig we'll talk about a little bit later. So we understand how cabbage works. The weed drift rig is designed to fish down in that gap below the first set of leaves and down to the bottom of the lake. Stay down there in that open area so we can actually catch fish, trigger fish, and draw them in. That's why the weed drift works so good. It's effective. You can fish 2 or 3 rods per person without a lot of hassle. And you constantly have a bait in the strike zone that's not getting hung up on the weeds you have to pull weeds off of. Pay attention, this weed drift rig is a really cool rig to fish. You're going to want to learn how to rig it. Okay, so let's talk about rigging the weed drift rig. So I've got my main line here, and the heart of this system is the weight, and we're going to use a bullet sinker. This is a bass style sliding bullet sinker. You want a bullet sinker, pointed nose, because it slides through the weeds. That's the whole idea of a bullet sinker, shaped like a bullet so it slides through the weeds and it doesn't get hung up, and it has to slide. That's important. Behind that, we're gonna add that to our main line. Then behind that, we're going to put on a little rattle bead. Now, these used to be easy to find. Northland Tackle used to sell these. See if you can see that right there. It's just a little 6mm rattle bead. It's a plastic bead with BBs inside it, so it makes a noise. That's an important part of this rig. You can go to Amazon.com, type in rattle beads, and you can find rattle beads, but you want it to be a rattle bead. That's important. Then behind that rattle bead, we're going to tie on just a regular crankbait snap, just our traditional little small crankbait snap that we use for attaching crankbaits. That's going to complete the main rigging of the system. Now, why is that rattle bead so important? The bullet sinker, let's go back. Let's start with the bullet sinker. I carry 3 sizes. Traditionally, 1/8, 3/16, and 1/4 are the 3 sizes I use. I really like the 3/16. I default almost every day to the 3/16. The 1/8 is a little too light, lifts the rig up a little bit, doesn't get down and really kind of be where it needs to be. And the 1/4 has a tendency to plow through the weeds, not kind of snake through the weeds. So 3/16 is my favorite size bullet sinker, but carry those 3 different weights depending on how deep you're fishing. The rattle bead is important for a couple different reasons. Number one, it stops that heavy sinker from banging up against the knot that's tying our crankbait snap on. That's important. You keep banging that weight against that knot, at some point it's going to weaken that knot. So that bead creates a little bit of a buffer and keeps that big heavy weight off of the knot. The other thing about the rattle bead is this: it makes noise. It rattles. Makes a low frequency sound, and fish are attracted to that. If you've ever seen underwater video of crayfish going through the weeds or on the bottom, they click, 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 click when they move. And that low frequency sound attracts fish. So every time imagine the sinker going through the bottom, it catches up on the weeds, it pulls free. That sinker is sliding. That's why it has to slide. And every time it slides, it bangs against that rattle bead. Click, click, click. It's sending a low frequency thud out that fish can feel with their letter line, and it's imitating crayfish and other bait that live in the weeds. The rattle bead is key. And then the snap, or the crankbait snap, is going to allow us to change our leaders that we're going to use. So that's the simple rigging. We'll talk about rods, reels, and line a little bit later, but that's the simple rigging. 1/8, 3/16, or 1/4 ounce bullet. Defer to 3/16. That should be your favorite. A rattle bead, and then a small crankbait snap. That's our basic rigging to get started fishing the weed drift rig. All right, so now that we're rigged up, we obviously have to have some kind of hook to catch fish, right? That kind of helps a little bit to have some kind of hook down here to help hook a fish if we need it. I'm going to show you the 3 basic setups that I use. First of all, let's talk a little bit about these lure options. Let's talk about the leader. All right, so it's really important that you get the right leader for doing this. I like to use mono. You don't want to use fluorocarbon because it sinks. You don't want to use braid because it's not stiff enough. I like a good quality, fairly stiff. I like Berkley XT, one of my favorites. I like Berkley XT in about 8-pound test. That is perfect. It's a low diameter, low stretch, very stiff monofilament. You definitely want to use monofilament. And this leader is only going to be about 18 to 20 inches long. You don't want it any longer because then it's going to float up and get in those weed leaves. Remember, we want it to stay down under the stalk. So 18 to 20 inches is about right with the leader, no longer than that, okay? At the end, we're going to tie a high quality ball bearing swivel, and then that ball bearing swivel is just going to attach to our crankbait snap on our main line. That stops line twist and makes it easy to change presentations. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do for hook options to actually attract fish? Well, number one is a floating jig head, and this is a Phelps floater for Northland Tackle. It's just basically a hook, and instead of lead, like a jig, it's a floating jig head. So this is foam, and it actually floats. It actually lifts up off the bottom and actually keeps that jig head off the bottom 4 or 5 inches, okay? Floating jig head, one of my favorite ways to do it. Add a little bit of color. I like bright colors. I like oranges. I like greens. I like chartreuses. Something that the walleyes can see in the weeds. make sure that it is nice and bright. So that's my first choice, or one of my first choices is, or one of my favorite choices is a floating jig head. That's important. Next one I want to talk about is just a plain hook, and I use octopus hooks. I like a size 4, so that's just a plain hook that you would use on a crawler harness, or just a regular upturned eye octopus hook that we'd snell on to tie a crawler harness. I like size 4. Size 2 is a little too heavy. Size 6 is a little small to handle big fish in the weeds. I like about a size 4. That's perfect. Then above that, I add 2 things. I add a rattle bead to make a little bit of noise, and then I add a foam float. These are just called rig floats. So you can see I've got a chartreuse bead and an orange float. Hey, what does orange and chartreuse look like when it's in the weeds? It's like a perch, right? So I'm using bright colors to imitate the bait fish that are in there. So I've got a number 4 hook, a rattle bead that adds a little bit of noise and a little flotation, and I've got a good size rig float on here that's made out of foam that's going to help, again, lift the bait up. It's going to keep the hook up off of the bottom, far enough to not get snagged in the char or the sandgrass that's on the bottom, but not far enough to get caught up in the leaves of the cabbage. So again, that 18 to 20 inches is critical. That's about the right length right there. So a single hook with a rattle bead and a float is another great way to rig. Now, my favorite way every single day, and the one that's probably made us the most money, is this. This is a single hook, snelled onto a line, just a number 4 hook. And then what we do is we add 1 or 2 floats and a rattle bead and then a smile blade. So I hope you can see this. This is a smile blade. A smile blade is made by Max Lure Company, and it's a blade. You can see it spinning there. It's a blade, but it's made out of the same material that like gallon milk jugs are made of, that plastic, and it's got a hole through the middle. So what happens is this spins, creates a little bit of vibration, a little bit of flash, but it's not heavy like a metal blade, so it doesn't drop down. So with 1 or 2 floats, a rattle bead, a single hook, as you're pulling this through, you're adding a little bit of flash, a little bit of vibration. You're giving the fish a little bit of chance to see it. That smile blade is spinning as it goes through the weeds, but it's not heavy like a metal blade, not dropping to the bottom. This is my favorite way to fish it. I probably had caught more fish on this than anything else, and the second one would probably be the floating jig head. Those 2 are my favorites, and then the hook with the float and the rattle bead would be my 3rd favorite. But number 1 would be this, a float or 2 with a rattle bead, Max Smile Blade, number 4 hook. Number 2 would be the floating jig head, just the foam floating jig head right here. That'd be my number 2 choice. Then my number 3 choice would be a snelled hook with a float and a rattle bead on it. That would be my 3rd choice. But those 3 right there are the 3 you're going to want to tie up, have some in the boat, have them ready to go, have little swivels on the end so you can hook it to the crankbait snap. You can change as you need. Let the fish tell you what they want. And those 3 options right there are going to catch you a lot of fish when you're fishing the weed drift rig through heavy weed banks. Well, obviously once we're rigged up, we're going to want to put some kind of live bait on this to attract fish, and I think live bait is the way to go. So let's talk about your 3 basic choices. Number 1, night crawlers. When we first started fishing this, we had night crawlers, we tried night crawlers, we caught some walleye on night crawlers, but what happens where you're fishing in those weeds at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 feet of weeds, guess what else lives there? Small bluegill, small perch, small crappie, everything lives there, and what happens, you get a nice juicy night crawler down there, and the next thing you know, it goes 5 feet and it gets pecked apart. Now you got just a little piece of night crawler. Not very effective, so we kind of nixed the night crawlers. Minnows are another one. They're hard to keep alive. We have used fathead minnows. They have worked very, very well. The problem with fathead minnows is they have a tendency to swim, and sometimes they swim up and actually pull floating jig head up. They get caught in the weeds. And minnows are really, really hard to keep alive, right? Especially as the summer goes on. Water gets a little bit warmer. Minnows are just a little tough to keep alive. You got to stop every morning and get them. Just a pain. Our number 1 bait, and if you know anything about me fishing in the weeds, my number 1 favorite bait for fishing this rig is a leech. I love leeches, medium or large leeches. Make sure you've got black, make sure you've got brown, because there are days that brown leeches will catch fish, black leeches won't. There are days that black leeches will catch fish, brown leeches won't. Make sure you have a couple of sizes. I like the medium and the large, because the fish can get pretty size sensitive. some days. All we're going to do is take a good live leech. And remember, guys, don't freak out. Bait leeches don't have teeth. They have suckers, but they don't have teeth. They can't break the skin. So you're just going to take the sucker of the leech. You're going to put the hook through the sucker or behind the sucker, and you're just going to let that leech kind of stretch out behind the bait. So as this rig is going through underneath the weeds, right, the sinker's down here, the float's going to lift it up just a little bit. That leech is doing its little leech dance 4, 5, 6, 7 inches off the bottom. Fish can't resist when they see it. So my favorite bait is leeches. You can try crawlers, but again, a lot of small fish peck apart your crawlers and make it tough to fish. Minnows are a little tougher to keep alive day in and day out. You can't beat a good, lively, medium or large leech as your bait of choice when you're fishing the weed drift rig. Okay, let's talk about the rod and the main line for fishing that. We've covered, when we talked about the rigs to use, the lure options, we talked about the line to use for leaders, 8-pound, maybe 10-pound monofilament is important. We want the monofilament because it does float. Now, main line is the same. I like a good quality, usually about 12-pound mono, or you can use 12-pound fluoro. I don't mind that my main line is fluorocarbon and it sinks a little bit. I'm okay with that. Don't use braid. Braid is too stiff. So my first choice is a good quality 10 or 12-pound mono. Second choice would be a good quality 10 or 12-pound thin diameter castable fluoro, but I like 12-pound mono for this. That seems to be the best. All right, let's talk about the rod. I want you to see the rod action. This is a fairly long rod. I fish long rods doing this. I like 7.5, 8, 8.5. When we first started doing it, we actually used our trolling rods, our planer board rods, because they're 8.5 foot long and they have a soft tip on them. That tip is important. You want a medium power, so you want some backbone, but you want, I'm going to try to get in front of the, so you can see how much of that, get in front of the map, you can see how much that rod is bending. That's important. We're going to talk about this in just a second. It's important that that rod bends about half the way, but once it's done bending, you're into some pretty good backbone. Spinning gear is good for this. Again, this is a inexpensive rod. It should be graphite because you do need the backbone, but it doesn't need to be a $100 rod. This can be a $39, $40 rod. Doesn't need to be really expensive. If you really want to do this, you know, sometimes you can go to some tackle stores. Every once in a while, they'll have a bin with $19.99 or $29.99, 7.5 foot, 2-piece spinning rods. Great rods for doing this. Just make sure you've got enough backbone. But that is the kind of bend that you want. You want half of the rod to bend, but you want a medium power and then a soft or moderate action. That is important. Mainline, again, 12-pound is a good compromise. 12-pound low stretch mono or 12-pound fluorocarbon. Either one, I don't care. But make sure you've got a good quality line. And you want it heavy enough. You want heavy enough to go through the weeds because this line is going to constantly be going through the weeds. So you want something that's abrasion resistant, that's not going to nick up, that you're going to be able to fish a lot and not worry about your main line breaking because it has gone through the weeds. It's been hung up a little bit. It's going to take a lot of abuse, so pick a good quality line. But that's the rod and the line that you want. Balance it with about a 2000 series spinning reel. You want it big enough that the line doesn't come off in coils, but light enough that the rod and reel balance pretty good. And that's going to get you set, a pretty easy setup for fishing the weed drift rig. Okay, let's talk about boat rigging and boat control for the weed drift rig. Now, there is a corresponding blog or article that goes with this seminar, the short course. Make sure that you read it because there's pictures in there that talk about how to rig and how to do the boat control. So you can see some pictures. I'm going to walk through it here in the short course video, but go back and read the blog because there's a little more detail there about how this is actually done. So what we want to do is this. We want to take the boat and move the boat through the water by drifting. This is a weed drift rig. We're going to drift it, which means we need a little bit of wind. We get our wind. We get set up on the part of the weed bed we think is going to hold fish. Hopefully it's a big flat. I like to find big flats so I can fish a long way, especially the first couple drifts, and then key in on the key spots that have fished. But it's called a weed drift rig, so we need a little bit of wind. We're going to find the wind and turn our boat perpendicular to the wind. So the wind's coming this way. We're going to turn our boat sideways. So our boat's going to be drifting with the wind sideways. So I like to fish off of the starboard side. So the starboard side is facing the wind. The wind is blowing against the starboard side of my boat. Now, it's important that we control our speed doing this. What we want to do is we want to make sure that our boat speed is moving at a speed that keeps our line at a 45-degree angle. We're talking about how to do this in just a second. That's important. So you're probably going to need a drift sock or two, an inexpensive drift sock. That's going to help slow you down. You can use your bow mount trolling motor a little bit. That will help, but having one or two small drift socks is going to be a big help also. The other thing you can do is turn your big engine. So you're drifting and all of a sudden the nose of the boat wants to go faster than the rear end because it's a little lighter. If you take your engine and turn the engine like you're turning into the wind, right? So I'm drifting, I'm going to turn it so I'm making a starboard turn. Now it's going to act like a rudder and it's actually going to move the nose of my boat and keep it closer to completely perpendicular to the wind. So just a couple tricks there that are going to help you. Boat rigging is important. You want to use cradle style rod holders. And you're going to spread them out on your starboard gunnel. I like the starboard. You're going to spread them out on the gunnel, and you're going to make a room that you can fish 4 rods. So you're going to want some cradle rod holders. They can be inexpensive, $9.99 action ones, or they can be the ones that I like are made by Trax Tech. I like the Salties. Those are some of my favorites, the Down Easters. I like those. They hold the rod good and sturdy. They're not coming out. They're easy to release. So boat rigging is going to be 4 cradle rod holders, 2 behind the console, 2 in front of the console for the guy in the front, 2 in the back for the guy in the back. And you want to make sure that you have a 1 or 2 small drift socks and a way to slow your boat down. And that's how we're going to set the boat up, rig the boat, and get ready for boat control. Put the bow mount trolling motor in so you can use it to help pull you and keep your boat perpendicular to the wind. This takes a little bit of fine tuning. Again, go back and read that blog. Helps you a little bit more, but that's basically the boat control and the boat rigging to get you started fishing the weed drift rig. Okay, our boat's all set up. We're perpendicular to the wind. We've got the speed controlled. How are we going to fish this rig? So what we're going to do is we're just going to take our fishing rod and we are going to take our line and we're just going to drop it to the bottom. So I'm going to put my leech on. I'm going to drop my weight to the bottom. Boom. And then what I do is I lift the rod twice. I go 1 pull, 2 pulls. So a little extra line out. I'm going to stick it in the rod holder. Okay, so this is going to be kind of hard to show you, but so let's imagine this is the gunnel of the boat. I'm going to lay my rod in the cradle like this. So I've got a rod that's forward of the nose of the boat, parallel to the gunnel. I've got a second rod that I'm going to set there that's going to be inside that. So the rod tip is going to be about in the middle of the front of the boat, and then I'm going to have 2 rods in the back that are doing the same thing. So the rods are going to be in cradles, parallel to the gunnel, just in rod holders. Now rod holders are very important. I'm going to show you why in just a second, but you want to put these rods in rod holders. Again, there's a really good picture in the blog, in the article. Read that, look at those pictures. It really explains how we're doing this. Now here's the key. Again, remember, we want our speed to keep that line going out at about a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to set it down. The rod's going to go out, and we want that line at about a 45-degree angle. Going to drop our weight down to the bottom. Boom, open the bail, lift about 1, let about 6 feet of line out, 6 more feet, about 10 to 12 more extra feet. Put it in the rod holder. It has to be in the rod holder. Here is why this weed drift rig is so effective. What's going to happen is you're going to be drifting along. Let me see if I can show you this. Let me kind of move my stool here a little bit. I'm going to need a little bit of room to do this. Okay, so you're moving along. I'm going to try to get that rod tip right in front of the map if I can. So you're moving along and the line's out this way. And what's going to happen is at some point that line is going to hook up and it's going to bend the rod. It's going to hook up on a weed and it's going to bend. Don't touch it. This is why you want it in a rod holder. If you had it in your hand, what would you do? You would jerk. Don't want to do that. So this rod is bent. It's bending forward, right? Because it's stuck in a weed. And then what's going to happen at some point, it's going to pull free. And it's going to pull this rig off of the weed. And what's going to happen is you're going to be tight. You're going to watch it come free. You're going to watch your weight hit the bottom once. It'll come back again, hit the weight bottom twice, come back, hit the bottom a third time. And usually at that point, the rod starts to dance because you got a fish on it. Most of your bites are going to come after you're hung up and the rig pulls free, right? So again, we're going to bend, let it bend. That's what we want it to do. Let it pull free, and then watch it. As it pulls free, and that sinker falls back once, back twice, get ready. Because at some point, it's going to try to come forward, and the fish is going to grab it, and it's going to make that rod tip dance, pull it out of the rod holder, set the hook, and you've got yourself a fish. It is absolutely critical that you fish this in a rod holder, so when you feel that hook get stuck in the weeds, you don't pull. You want to let it go through the process of hooking up and pulling free, because that is what attracts the fish. And usually after the second or third drop, after it pulls free, that's when you're going to get your bite. All right? So there you go. That's a little idea of how to fish the drift rig. Again, for boat control and how to fish this rig, go back to the article. There's lots of cool stuff there that's going to help you get tuned in a little bit better. Some great pictures. They're going to show you how we rig, but that's how we rig up and how we fish the weed drift rig. Great rig, man. Catches a lot of fish. You're going to love it once you learn how to try it. Okay, well, there is your introduction to the weed drift rig. I hope you had as much fun listening to me as I did talking about. I love this rig. I can't wait to get on the water and get some video of it working. It's absolutely an amazing rig. It catches so many fish. It's not even funny. Like I said, it's been my #1 moneymaker over my tournament career. And we've never fished a tournament that we've used the weed drift rig in the weeds. Never fished an event that we haven't cashed a big fish check. Sometimes we've actually cast big fish check both days fishing this rig. It's a great rig for getting big fish and lots of fish out of the weeds. So what did we talk about? We talked about how walleyes live in the weeds. We talked about how cabbage weed grows and how fish can actually move around there. We talked about why the weed drift rig works, how to rig the drift rig, some lure options that you have, the right bait to use. We talked about the right rod and line. We talked a little bit about boat rigging and boat control. And most importantly, we talked about how to get that rig to the bottom, give it a few extra feet of line, put it in a rod holder, and let it fish. Let it hang up, let it pull free, and wait for the rod tip to dance with your first walleye. So lots of information there. Go back and watch it a couple times. Go back and read the article. Rig up 1 or 2. Head out to your favorite lake that has weeds. Grab a couple dozen leeches, hook them up, get that weed rig to the bottom, get your drift speed right, and I promise you, you're going to catch some great walleye this summer fishing this weed drift rig at your favorite lake in green weeds. When everybody else is out there chasing them where there's no weeds to mess with, you're going to be in the weeds catching fish that they're not going to catch. Promise you, you're going to surprise all your friends. Hey, thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next time at Teaching Fishing.